Assalamualaikum warahmatullahi wabarakatuh. We are from the group 6 about government and society. The ground of government. William the Quaker had governed England and Normandy by traveling from one place to another to make sure that his authority was accepted. He and the kings after him raised some of the money they needed by trying cases and finding people in the royal courts. The king's household was the government and it was always on the move. There was no real capital of the kingdom as there is today. Kings were crowned in Westminster, but their treasury stayed in the old Wessex capital with Winchester. When William and the kings after him moved around the country staying in the towns and the castles, they were accompanied by a large number of followers. Wherever they went, the local people had to give them food and somewhere to stay. It could have a terrible effect. Food drowned out and prices rose. This form of government could only work well for a small kingdom. By the time the English kings were ruling half of France as well, they could no longer travel everywhere themselves. But even this system needed people who could administer taxation, justice, and call out of the king's introduction. At first, this administration was based in Winchester, but by the time of Edward I in 1290, it had moved to Westminster. It is still there today. However, even though the administration was in Westminster, the real capital of England was still in the King's Shadow. The king kept all his records in Westminster, including the Domesday Book. The king's administration kept a careful watch on noble families. It made slight the king claimed money every time a young noble took over the lands of his father or when a noble's daughter married. In every possible way, the king always had his hand in his subjects' pocket. This administration also kicked the town and the pots to make sure that taxes were paid and keep a record of the fines made by the king's court. Most important of all, the officials in Westminster had to watch the economy of the country carefully. Was the king getting the money he needed in the most effective way? Such questions lead to important changes in taxation between 1066 and 1300. In 1130, well over half of Henry's money came for his own land, one third from his fellow vassals in rags and fines, and only 1/7 from taxes. 150 years later, over half of its money came from taxes, but only 1/3 came from his son and only 1/10 from his fellow vassals. It is no wonder that Edward called to his parliament a representative of the people whom they could tax most effectively. The amount of marks used for seals on official papers gives an idea of the rapid growth of the royal administration. 1220 at the beginning of Henry III's reign, 1.15 kilograms were used each week. 40 years later, in 1360, this had risen to 42 kilograms weekly, and government administration has been growing ever since. Law and justice. The king, of course, was responsible for law and justice, but kings usually had left the administration of this important matter to someone who lived close to the place where a crime was committed. In ancient times, every district had its own laws and customs, and justice had often been a family matter. They had freedom to act more or less as they liked. More serious offenses, however, were tied family were no longer only a family matter but a breaking of the king's peace. It was therefore the king's duty to try people and punish them. At first, the nobles acted for the king on their own lands, but Henry wanted the same kind of justice to be used everywhere. At first, the king's judges had no special knowledge or training. They were simply trusted to use common sense. Many of them were nobles or bishops who followed directly the orders of the king. It is not surprising that the quality of judge depended on the choice of the king. Henry II, the most powerful English king of the 12th century, was known in Europe for the high standards of his law courts. The convincing proof of our king's strength, worth one man, is that wherever has a just cause want to have it tried before him, wherever has a weak one, thus cannot unless he is judged. By the end of the 12th century, the judges were men with real knowledge and experience of the law. But although English lawyers referred to this as example of legal method and science, they created an entirely different system of law based on custom comparison. The new class of judge was also interested in how the law was carried out and what kinds of punishments were used. From Anglo-Saxon times, there had been two ways and deciding difficult cases when it was not clear if a man was innocent or guilty. The accused man could be tested in the battle against a scaled tongue. If the burn mark was still there 3 days later, he was thought to be guilty. It was argued that God would leave the burn mark on a guilty man's tongue. By the end of the 12th century, where there was serious doubt, and in 1215 the Pope forbade the church to have anything to do with trial or by ordeal. In England, trial by ordeal was replaced with trial by jury. The jury idea dates back to the days of Danelaw, but had only been used in disputes over land. Henry II already introduced the use of juries for some cases in the second half of the 12th century, but it was not the kind of jury we know today. In 1179, he allowed an accused man in certain cases. claimed trial by jury. The men could choose the neighbors 12 good men and true religious beliefs. The courage at local village level was significantly different from the politically powerful organizations the king had to deal with at the time of William I. The ordinary village priest called hardly read at all, and he was usually one of the prison community. His church belonged to the local world and was often built next to the Lord's house. Almost all priests were married and many inheriting their position from their father. However, even at village level, the church wished to replace the Lord's authority with its own, but it was only partly successful. A monk could learn to read and write and be sure of with ancestors. The monasteries were centers of wealth and learning. In 1066, there were 50 religious houses in England, home for perhaps 1,000 monks and nuns. By the beginning of the 14th century, there were probably about 900 religious houses with 17,500 members. Even though the population in the 14th century was 3 times larger than it had been in 1066, the growth of the monasteries is impressive. The 13th century brought a new movement, the Brotherhood of Friars. Ordinary people in country and town. There were probably between 1.5 and 2 million people living in England in 1066. The Domesday Book tells us that 19 of them lived in the countryside. It also tells us that 80% of the land used for farming at the beginning of the 20th century was already being tilled in 1086. In fact, it was not until the 19th century that the cultivated area became greater than the level recorded in the Domesday Book. Life in the countryside was hard. The poor were divided from their masters by the feudal class system. The basis of this mineral system was the exchange of land for labor. The landlord expected the villagers to work and wasted number of days on his own land, the home farm. The rest of the time they worked on their small strips of land, part of the village common land, and which they grew food for themselves and their family. The Domesday Book tells us that over 3/4 of the country people were slaves. They were not free to leave their lord's service or his land without permission. Even if they were to turn away, there was nowhere to run to.
In the early days of the conquest, Saxons and Normans feared and hated each other. For example, if a dead body was found, the Saxons had to prove that it was not the body of a murdered Norman. If they could not prove it, the Normans would burn the nearest village. The Norman ruling class only really began to mix with and marry the Saxon, and considered themselves English rather than French. After King John, after King John lost Normandy in 1204. Even then, this like remained between the rulers and the ruled. Every school child knows the story of Robin Hood, which grew out of Saxon hatred for Norman rule. According to the legend, Robin Hood lived in Sherwood Forest near Nottingham as a criminal or outlaw. Outside feudal society and the protection of the law, he stole from the rich and gave the poor, and he stood up for the weak against the powerful. His weapon was not the sword of nobles and knight, but the longbow, the weapon of the common man. In fact, most of the story is legend. The only thing we know is that a man called Robert or Robin Hood was a wanted criminal in Yorkshire in 1230. The legend was, however, very popular with the common people all through the 14th, 15th, and 16th centuries. Although the ruling class greatly disliked it. Later, the story was changed. Robin Hood was described as a man. Robin Hood was described as a man of noble birth whose land had been taken by King John. Almost certainly, this was an effort by the authorities to make Robin Hood respectable. Most landlords obtained their income directly from the home farm, and also from letting out some of their land in return for rent in crops or money. The size of the home farm depends on how much the land the landlord chose to let out. In the 12th century, for example, many landlords found it more profitable to let out almost all the home farmlands and thus be paid in money or crops rather than in labor. In fact, it is from this period that word farm comes. Each arrangement the landlord made to let land to a villager was a firma, a fixed or settled agreement. Moved to the growth of towns as centers of wealth. England was to a very large degree an agricultural society. Even in towns and cities, many of those involved in trade or industry also farm small holding of land of the edge of town. In this sense, England was self-sufficient. However, throughout the Middle Age, England needed things from abroad, such as salt and spices. Inside England, there was a good deal of trade between different regions. Wool grooming areas, for example, imported food from food producing areas. However, it is harder to know the extent of this internal trade because it was less formal than international trade and therefore less recorded. We know more about we know more about international trade, which was recorded because the king obtained a considerable income from customs dues. During the Anglo-Saxon period, most European trade had been with the Frisians in the Low Countries, around the mouth of the river Rhine. Following the Viking invasion, most trade from the 9th century onward had taken place with Scandinavia. By the 11th century, for example, English grain was highly valued in Norway. In return, England imported Scandinavian fish and sold timber. However, by the end of the 12th century, this Anglo-Scandinavian trade link had weakened. This was the result of the Norman conquest, after which England looked away from the northeast, Scandinavia and Germany, and towards the south, France, the Low Countries, and beyond. The royal family had links with Gascony in southwest France, and this led to important trade exchange of wine for cloth and cereal. However, easily the most important link was once again with the Low Countries, and the basics of this trade was wool. Family had links with Gascony in southwest France, and this led to important trade exchange of wine for cloth and cereal. However, easily the most important link was once again with the Low Countries, and the basis on this trade was wool. Okay, next to language, literature, and culture. The growth of literacy in England was closely connected with the 12th century Renaissance, a cultural movement which had first started in Italy. Its influence moved northwards along the trade routes, reaching England at the end of the century. This revolution in ideas and learning brought a new desire to test religious faith against reason. Schools of learning were established in many towns and cities. Some were grammar schools independent of the church. All of these schools taught Latin because most books were written in this language. Although it may seem strange for education to base on a dead language, Latin was important because it was the educated language of almost all Europe, and was therefore useful in the spread of ideas and learning. In spite of the dangers, the church took a lead in the new intellectual movement in England. Two schools of higher learning were established, the first at Oxford and the second at Cambridge. At the end of the 12th century, by the 12th and 20th, these two universities were the intellectual leaders of the country. Few could go to the universities. Most English people spoke neither Latin, the language of the church and of education, nor French, the language of the law and of the Norman rules. It was a long time before English became the language of the ruling class. Some French words became part of the language, and often kept a more polite meaning than Old Anglo-Saxon words. For example, the word chair, which came from the French, described a better piece of furniture than the Anglo-Saxon word tool. In the same way, the Anglo-Saxon word belly was replaced in polite society by the word stomach. Other Anglo-Saxon words ceased to be used altogether. Thank you.